Only 9 people were in that training hall in Moscow, and every one of them, decades later, still remembered the exact sound the mat made. Not a slam, not a crash, a single sharp exhale of air pressing through canvas, the sound of 900 pounds of combined force meeting a surface designed to absorb considerably less than that, twice within the same 90 seconds. The first time, the sound came from the much larger van going down. Nobody in that room had expected the second time to happen at all. This was Moscow, 1985, a closed-door international wrestling exhibition, the kind that happened quietly between Cold War athletic programs eager to test their best against unfamiliar opponents without the political complications of an official, publicized contest. And in a room full of serious men who understood exactly what they were watching, one Soviet wrestler made a selection that 9 witnesses would spend the rest of their lives trying to properly describe. He picked the smallest man in the room. He had no idea who he'd picked. To understand what happened on that mat, you first need to understand the specific kind of athlete Soviet wrestling produced in the 1980s, and why the wrestler in this story represented something close to the apex of that system. Soviet amateur wrestling during the Cold War era was not simply a sport, it was a state-funded, scientifically optimized national program, built on a talent identification pipeline that began identifying promising children before they reached their teenage years and funneled the most gifted among them into training facilities staffed by sports scientists, biomechanics specialists, and coaches whose sole professional purpose was producing wrestlers capable of dominating international competition. The wrestler at the center of this story had come up through exactly that system: freestyle wrestling, heavyweight division, 6'3", 260 pounds, with the specific, dense, explosively powerful build that the Soviet program's training methodology, heavy emphasis on Olympic-style lifting, explosive plyometric work, and live wrestling volume that exceeded what most Western athletes trained at, consistently produced. By 1985, he had won a world championship and was widely considered the favorite heading into the next Olympic cycle, before the political complications of the era's boycotts would ultimately keep him from competing on that particular stage. Within the closed, insular world of serious international wrestling, his name carried the specific weight that attached to athletes who were, by any technical measure available, operating near the absolute peak of human capability in their discipline. He had never lost a match to anyone outside an extremely small circle of fellow elite competitors. He had certainly never lost to anyone who wasn't a dedicated full-time wrestler. This particular exhibition had been arranged through unofficial athletic diplomacy channels, a closed-door gathering bringing together a small group of American martial artists and combat sports figures who happened to be traveling through Moscow on a cultural exchange program, paired loosely with a handful of Soviet wrestling program athletes for informal demonstration and exchange. Nothing official, nothing for the press. The specific, quiet kind of mutual professional curiosity that occasionally crossed Cold War lines even when the broader political relationship between the two countries remained tense. The Soviet wrestler had been asked, somewhat informally, whether he'd be willing to demonstrate technique against one of the visiting Americans, a chance for cultural exchange disguised as these things often were as athletic curiosity. He looked across the room at the assembled visitors. Most of them were obviously athletic, broader builds, the specific carriage of serious combat sports competitors. One man near the back of the group stood out only for how unremarkable he looked by comparison. Average height, lean rather than bulky, dressed in plain training clothes that communicated no specific affiliation or achievement. The wrestler, through an interpreter, gestured toward him. Partly out of genuine curiosity, partly, if the accounts of those present are to be fully believed, out of the specific kind of confidence that sometimes leads dominant athletes to select the opponent who appears to present the least possible challenge, a low-risk demonstration rather than a genuine test. He had no way of knowing that the unremarkable man he'd just selected held 6 consecutive world middleweight karate championships, had trained continuously since 1958, and had spent decades deliberately seeking out exactly this kind of unfamiliar cross-discipline test whenever the opportunity presented itself. Chuck Norris, in 1985, was 45 years old. He was deep into the most commercially successful period of his film career. The Missing in Action franchise had made him one of the biggest action stars in the world, and the cultural exchange trip that had brought him to Moscow was on its surface a goodwill gesture connected loosely to his public profile. But the trip's official purpose obscured something more personal and more consistent with the pattern that had defined his entire training career, a genuine ongoing curiosity about combat traditions he hadn't yet directly experienced. Soviet wrestling, with its specific emphasis on explosive power, positional dominance, and live wrestling volume that exceeded almost anything in the Western combat sports world at the time, represented exactly the kind of unfamiliar territory that Norris had sought out his entire adult life. He had trained in judo,
He understood grappling principles, leverage, the management of an opponent's center of gravity, even though his competitive career had been built almost entirely in striking disciplines. He had been cross-training with wrestlers and grapplers in Los Angeles for years by this point, deliberately filling in exactly the kind of gaps that a tournament karate background, however decorated, inevitably left in a complete fighter's skill set. He stood near the back of the small American contingent that evening, dressed in plain clothes, watching the early portion of the exhibition with the same quiet, attentive interest he brought to every unfamiliar training environment he'd ever entered. When the Soviet wrestler's gesture indicated him, he didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and stepped toward the mat.
The interpreter explained the basic premise of the demonstration to both men, a brief, controlled exhibition of freestyle wrestling technique, beginning with a standing clinch exchange and proceeding, if both parties were comfortable, into live takedown attempts, at a pace the visiting American could genuinely learn from rather than simply being overwhelmed by. It was meant to be instructional, generous even, a genuine attempt at the kind of cross-discipline exchange that occasionally made these closed-door cultural events worthwhile beyond their diplomatic function. The Soviet wrestler approached the center of the mat with the loose, settled confidence of a man who had performed exactly this kind of low-stakes demonstration countless times throughout his career, visiting dignitaries, junior athletes, curious foreign guests, all of them providing roughly the same experience. Brief, controlled contact, followed by an easy, technically clean demonstration of dominance that satisfied everyone's curiosity without requiring genuine effort. Norris stepped onto the mat opposite him. The size differential was immediately visibly apparent to everyone in the room. 6'3" against 5'10", 260 pounds of dense, explosively trained mass against a frame that, while clearly athletic, carried nothing close to that kind of raw physical scale. Several of the 9 witnesses, in later accounts, admitted to feeling something close to second-hand embarrassment on the smaller man's behalf, the specific, uncomfortable anticipation of watching a mismatch play out exactly as mismatches of this kind almost always did. The interpreter explained the basic clinch position both men should assume to begin. They settled into it. Collar ties, the specific grip-fighting posture that initiates almost every freestyle wrestling exchange. He adjusted, applying more pressure into the tie, the specific increased intensity that, against any genuinely untrained opponent, would have ended the grip exchange immediately and established full positional control. Norris matched the pressure rather than being overwhelmed by it, using a structural alignment, weight centered low, elbows tucked tight against his ribs, that distributed the incoming force rather than simply absorbing it directly through his upper body. The wrestler, now genuinely engaged rather than performing routine, shifted his approach. He attempted a single-leg takedown entry, dropping his level explosively, driving toward Norris's lead leg with the kind of fast, low-penetration step that had ended thousands of his opponent's matches across his competitive career. Norris read the level change. He didn't attempt to simply sprawl backward away from the shot, the common but often ineffective response of untrained opponents facing a skilled wrestler's takedown attempt. Instead, he dropped his own hips simultaneously, meeting the wrestler's penetrating shot with a counter-pressure that used the larger man's own forward momentum against his base, redirecting rather than purely resisting. The wrestler's takedown attempt stalled. For a serious wrestler of his caliber, a stalled single-leg shot against an opponent who shouldn't have possessed the specific defensive knowledge required to stall it represented something close to an alarm bell, a piece of information his entire competitive instinct told him to take seriously, immediately, regardless of how the man's size and unremarkable appearance had initially suggested he should be assessed. He reset, genuinely focused now, the casual confidence of the demonstration's opening moments replaced by the specific, narrowed attention of an elite competitor encountering an unexpected problem. He attempted a different entry, a high crotch variation, designed to attack from a different angle and exploit whatever structural weakness the first attempt might have revealed. Norris again read the entry early, this time using a controlled hip rotation that turned the entry into a brief contested scramble rather than the clean takedown the wrestler's technique should have produced against virtually any non-wrestler on Earth. In that scramble, a confused, close-quarters exchange of shifting weight and contested grips that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, Norris found an angle. It was not a wrestling technique in the strict technical sense. It drew instead on the same principles of leverage, timing, and structural efficiency that had defined his striking career, applied now to a grappling context his decades of cross-discipline curiosity had at least partially prepared him for. He used the wrestler's own forward-driving momentum, redirected through a sharp hip turn, to bring the larger man's base out from beneath him. The Soviet wrestler, 260 pounds of Olympic-caliber athletic mass, went down. The mat made the sound 9 witnesses would describe for the rest of their lives, with almost identical language, a single, sharp exhale of pressurized air, the specific sound of significant force meeting canvas. The room had gone completely silent.
The wrestler rose from the mat with the specific controlled deliberateness of a world-class athlete absorbing genuinely unexpected information. Not embarrassed exactly, but processing, recalibrating, working through the immediate tactical question of how a man with no apparent wrestling background had just neutralized two of his most reliable takedown entries and reversed his positional advantage entirely. He said something to the interpreter, low, measured, without the irritation the moment might reasonably have produced to a less disciplined competitor. The interpreter related to the small American contingent. He was asking, genuinely, where this particular visitor had trained. Norris answered honestly, explaining his striking background, the decades of cross-discipline work, the deliberate effort throughout his career to seek out exactly this kind of unfamiliar grappling exposure whenever circumstances allowed. The wrestler listened to the full translation. Then he did something that several of the 9 witnesses present would later describe as genuinely uncharacteristic for a man of his stature within Soviet wrestling-specific competitive culture. He asked, directly, whether they could continue, not as a demonstration this time, as a genuine, full-effort exchange, the kind he typically reserved on training partners within his own elite competitive circle. Norris agreed. The second exchange carried none of the performed casualness of the first. The wrestler attacked immediately, decisively, with the full explosive intensity that had made him a world champion, a rapid, technically precise combination of grip fighting and level changes, designed to overwhelm through pure speed and power, rather than allow any opening for the kind of structural counter that had ended the first exchange. Norris absorbed the initial pressure, his structure compressing under genuinely elite-level force in a way the first exchange's reduced intensity hadn't required, but rather than being driven backward and controlled, he used the brief moment of contact to drop his center of gravity sharply, denying the wrestler the clean angle his takedown entries required. The wrestler adjusted instantly, a lateral redirect, attacking a new angle the moment the first failed to develop, the kind of rapid tactical adaptation that separated elite competitors from merely talented ones. For nearly 15 seconds, the exchange became something genuinely contested, neither man establishing clean dominance, both searching for the small structural advantage that would resolve the impasse, the specific grinding intensity of two serious competitors fully engaged, rather than one demonstrating technique to a passive partner. Then the wrestler, attempting a hip throw variation that required him to briefly extend his base wider than usual to generate the necessary leverage, created an opening that Norris's structural training immediately recognized. A sharp redirect, using the wrestler's own extended position against him. The mat made the sound a second time. 9 witnesses stood in complete silence. The wrestler lay on the mat for several seconds before rising, not injured but genuinely, visibly processing something his entire competitive career had never previously required him to process. He sat up. He looked at Chuck Norris. He started laughing. Not a performed laugh, not the careful, face-saving laughter that athletes sometimes deploy to manage public embarrassment. A genuine, slightly disbelieving laugh. The specific sound of a world-class competitor encountering something so far outside his expectations that disbelief, momentarily, outpaced any other response available to him. He said something to the interpreter, still laughing, shaking his head slightly. The interpreter related. He says he picked you because he looked like the easiest choice in the room. He paused, listening to the wrestler add something further. He says he was wrong about that, in a way he's never been wrong before.
The 2 men spoke for nearly 30 minutes afterward, through the interpreter, in a conversation that several witnesses described as genuinely warm, 2 serious competitors comparing notes on training methodology, on the specific differences between Soviet wrestling's state-funded scientific approach and the more individualized cross-discipline path that had defined Norris's decades of training. The wrestler asked detailed questions about striking mechanics, about how Norris had developed the specific structural awareness that had neutralized 2 of his most reliable takedown entries. Norris asked in turn about the specific training volume and intensity that Soviet wrestling's program demanded, the methodology behind producing athletes capable of generating and absorbing the kind of explosive force he'd just experienced directly. It was, by every account available, exactly the kind of genuine cross-cultural exchange that the broader diplomatic trip had been theoretically designed to produce, achieved instead through an unplanned, almost accidental athletic test that neither man's itinerary had anticipated. The Soviet wrestler continued his competitive career for several more years, eventually retiring as one of the most statistically dominant freestyle wrestlers his country's program had produced during that specific era. He never publicly referenced the Moscow exhibition. There was no institutional context in which doing so would have served his career, and Soviet athletic culture, in any case, rarely encouraged its most accomplished competitors to dwell publicly on isolated moments of unexpected difficulty, regardless of how genuinely instructive those moments had proven privately. But people within his training circle, in later years, occasionally noted a specific shift in how he approached unfamiliar opponents during the increasingly common international exhibition matches that opened up as Cold War athletic isolation gradually eased throughout the late 1980s. He stopped assuming that unremarkable size or appearance automatically indicated reduced danger. He had learned in roughly 90 seconds of genuine contact against a man he'd selected specifically because he looked like the easiest choice available, something that years of dominant competition within his own insulated system had never required him to learn, that genuine cross-discipline depth, accumulated honestly over decades, does not always announce itself through visible size or obvious athletic markers. Here is what 9 witnesses ultimately took from that evening, once the disbelief settled into something more permanent and considered. The Soviet wrestler's selection process had not been unreasonable.
given the visible information available to him, size, build, the absence of any specific markers indicating elite combat sports achievement, choosing the apparently least challenging visitor for a low-stakes demonstration was, by any conventional athletic logic, a sound decision. The decision's failure was not a failure of judgment in any conventional sense. It was a failure of category. The same failure that appears again and again throughout the history of serious martial arts, whenever visible markers of size, build, or apparent athletic specialization are mistaken for a complete account of what an opponent actually carries. Chuck Norris's decades of cross-discipline training, accumulated quietly and continuously since 1958, had built something that didn't show on the surface in any way the wrestler's selection process could have accounted for. Striking mechanics translated imperfectly but genuinely into structural awareness that neutralized takedown attempts. Decades of competition-tested timing and leverage principles translated, again imperfectly but genuinely, into the specific counter that brought a 260-pound Olympic-caliber athlete to the mat, twice in a single evening. Chuck Norris was 45 years old in that Moscow training hall. He had never specifically trained in Olympic freestyle wrestling. He had simply trained broadly enough, honestly enough, continuously enough since 1958 that when a 260-pound Soviet champion selected him as the easiest available test, what he found within his own decades of accumulated cross-discipline principle was sufficient to answer the test directly. Twice, in the same evening, against a man who had built his entire competitive identity around exactly the kind of dominance that evening was supposed to confirm rather than complicate. A closed training hall in Moscow, a Soviet wrestling champion accustomed to selecting his opponents from a position of total, unquestioned advantage, and a quiet, unremarkable man near the back of the room who happened to look, by every visible measure, like the easiest possible choice. What began as a low-stakes demonstration intended to satisfy curiosity without requiring genuine effort became instead a direct, unscripted test of exactly how far genuine cross-discipline depth could travel beyond its original boundaries, answered twice in the same sharp exhale of pressurized canvas, in front of 9 witnesses who would spend decades trying to properly describe what they'd seen. The wrestler laughed, not in defeat, in genuine disbelieving appreciation, the specific sound of a world-class competitor encountering something his entire framework had no category for, and choosing honesty over wounded pride. He had picked the smallest man in the room. He had no idea who he'd picked. By the time he found out, the mat had already told him everything that mattered. He was 45 years old in that training hall. He had been training since 1958. He had never claimed wrestling mastery he didn't possess. He had simply built, across 27 years of honest, continuous cross-discipline work, exactly enough genuine principle to survive an honest test against one of the finest wrestlers his era produced.